And since it is 10:01, call our meeting to order, and we will start with our minutes of the last meeting. Jim.
Hi, everyone. President Jack Baker called the Goingsnake District Heritage Association meeting to order at 10:35 a.m. with 22 members and guests present. Wanda Elliott welcomed everyone to the depot, and everyone introduced themselves. Secretary Jim Terry read the minutes of the October and November minutes, and they were approved as read. The financial report was read by Treasurer Ruth Faulkner. Total monies as of December 18th, 2021 is $14,826.74. The report was approved as given. In new business, Vice President David Hampton made 3 motions for donations. First was $100 to the Talbot Library and Museum, where we had our July meeting. Second was $100 to the Adair County Historical and Genealogy Association that owns the depot in Stillwell. And third was $50 to the Help in Crisis Children's Advocacy Center in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, to honor GDHA member Diane Barker Harold, who passed recently. David's 3 motions were seconded and passed by unanimous votes. Jack Baker told us about the progress Maryville Chase is making at the Physical Rehab Center in Tulsa. She is walking with a walker now. David Hampton talked about his new 2-volume Nancy Ward books. GDHA member Mary Adair painted the cover artwork. Wanda Elliott told us about the Adair County Historical and Genealogy Association's December book sale and website. Jack Baker gave his traditional Christmas presentation, reading from the Moravian diaries at Christmas time at the Spring Place Mission in 1821. Jack adjourned the meeting at 11:20 a.m. We enjoyed a very good Christmas dinner immediately after the meeting.
Thanks, Jim. Are there any additions or corrections? Then I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes as read.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved. Okay. Jim, did you get a treasurer's report from Ruth?
No, I didn't.
And I didn't either, which we normally do.
I just checked on that right before I logged in here. And no, I didn't.
How was the food?
The food was fantastic as always. And
Imagine.
yeah. So, okay. Do we have any old business? Or do we have any new business?
I'd like to make a motion here.
Okay.
Today's supposed to be officers' election day, but I move that we postpone it until February.
Okay. Is there a second?
I second that motion.
Okay, motion's been seconded that we postpone our elections until our February meeting. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. So we will have those next month. The program I'm giving today is primarily from Moravian Records, so I invited people from the Moravian Archives and also Jeff Long, who is working on the next volume, and much of my presentation will be taken from that volume. So Jeff is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but from Salem area originally. Is that correct?
That is correct. Thank you so much for inviting me to your meeting.
Okay.
Nice to see everybody.
And we have Peggy Carter, who's on the Moravian Archives board. And it's good to have you with us, Peggy. And if there are other board members, I'll let you introduce them.
I have been skimming, Jack, and I don't see anybody quite yet, but I will let you know through chat if they do get a chance to join us. Thank you.
Good. And Courtney Lewis, it's good to have you with us. And it's always good to see Melissa. Of course, I had a meeting with Melissa last night on Zoom. So.
It's so good to see you, Jack.
And Anna, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you. Melissa, it's good to see you. It's good to see everybody. Hey, Curtis.
And we mentioned Mary Bell, who's one of our very dear members. And she has had health problems, but just an update, she is back home now. So hopefully she'll be able to join us before long. Good. So, okay. Okay. And it's a, Peggy and Jeff, we have people from all over the country because Patsy, well, is from Georgia, but you're in Tampa now, right?
No, I'm at home and we're gonna have snow tomorrow.
Okay. So Patsy's in Georgia. We have, I saw Andy, who's from California. So I don't, of course, there's Cleta from Chattanooga.
Oh.
So, and Courtney's from South Carolina.
Great.
So we have people from all over. Gigi's from Dallas area. So it's good. And this is something we were able to do with our Zoom meetings that we weren't able to do before because we always met in person before. But now then we can bring in people from all over the country, and we've had speakers from all over the country.
Great.
Mike Rand's from Atlanta, and he's spoken for us, so very good. And we have Troy Wayne Poteet, who's our Executive Director of the Trail of Tears Association. And Becky, it's always great to have Becky, who's our songwriter, singer, playwright from
Everything.
Becky, can you announce what you're doing this week?
I think I can.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we are doing a table read for Broadway producers and financial backers on January 23rd.
Wow.
Yeah, and this was something that was originally scheduled for 2020 and it kept getting postponed. And anyway, it's back on and we are going to do it as safely as possible. But we've got 3 guys coming in from New York that have all won Tonys and had lots of success on Broadway. And they are connected to one of the biggest producers who's on Broadway, who has produced over 90 Broadway productions. So we are praying that everything goes well. And the main thing here, as you all know, is to tell Nancy Ward's story and to bring her message of hope and peace to today's world. And I have worked on this for many, many years. I started writing some of the songs back in 1993. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I've had a lot of help, and especially from David Hampton. He has been our go-to everything Nancy Ward. And David, we appreciate you more than you'll ever know.
Right. Go, David.
And Peggy and Jeff, Nancy Ward was one of our beloved women. She actually visited the mission site, I believe it was in 1808. And there's some descriptions of her, and it talks about her being beloved of both the whites and browns alike. So she also visited the Spring Place mission. So it's exciting news.
Yeah, very excited. Grateful.
So it's good to have Dr. Bill Ambrose from Missouri chapter Trail of Tears.
Good morning. We've got your snow right now.
Do you? Well, I
Yes,
wish
sir.
it was back. I would like lots of it.
You can have it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Could you please keep the ice?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I assume it's headed your way. You're not getting it in North Carolina yet, are you?
Not yet. It's supposed to come tonight.
Okay. Good. So I call this Rebuilding a Nation. It's in 1839. And our Cherokee Nation is now in northeastern Oklahoma. But how did this become the Cherokee Nation? Our original lands were in the southeastern part of the states. And following the Revolutionary War, several of our Cherokees who had sided with the British moved west of the Mississippi to Spanish territory, eventually residing in west central Arkansas, which is shown as number 37 here. That was our lands in Arkansas. With the cession of a large amount of land in the east by the treaties of 1817 and 1819, which included most of our ancient towns, including Catawba and Shota, the home of Nancy Ward, our lands were reduced by 90%. These 1817 and 1819 cessions, however, also granted the Cherokee Nation title to the lands in Arkansas, which once again is 37, where about 1,000 of our people were living. And these Arkansas lands were then traded by an 1828 treaty for the lands that are now our jurisdictional area in present northeastern Oklahoma. So that's this pinkish red peach colored number 46, which is our current jurisdiction, because we had sold the other lands and the lands in Kansas following the Civil War, and not by choice for the most part. So the Arkansas Cherokees, who became known as the Old Settler Cherokees, then moved en masse in the summer of 1829 from Arkansas to our present nation. By the Treaty of 1835, the remainder of our lands in the east were ceded by that fraudulent treaty. While the majority of the Cherokee Nation were opposed to this treaty, it nevertheless was implemented in 1838, with the vast majority of our people being forced from their homes and into camps for removal. And while they were in these camps, at a general council of the Cherokee people, a resolution was passed on August 1st, 1838. And part of this resolution states, and whereas the Cherokee people have existed as a distinct national community in the possession and exercise of the appropriate and essential attributes of sovereignty for a period extending into antiquity, beyond the dates and records and memory of man, resolved therefore by the National Committee and Council and people of the Cherokee Nation and General Council assembled, that the inherent sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation, together with the Constitution, laws, and usages of the same, are, and by the authority aforesaid, are hereby declared to be in full force and virtue, and shall continue so to be in perpetuity. And this resolution became of prime importance once it arrived in the West, where the old settlers were operating under their own form of government. Because this resolution provided that the government of the newly immigrated Cherokees, who became known as the immigrant Cherokees, was in full force and effect as it had been in the East. So we now had two governments operating in the Cherokee Nation. And this problem had to be resolved by the two groups of Cherokee. While the nation's government had to be rebuilt, the immigrant Cherokees had to rebuild their homes and farms. After the old settlers removed from Arkansas, they settled primarily along the principal waterways majority of them along the Arkansas and Grand Rivers. And many of the treaty party had arrived a couple of years before and had also settled along the various streams. Much of the land, however, was still vacant. 3 of the Moravian missionaries had been in the camps with the Cherokees during the summer of 1838. And this is covered in the last volume 10 of the Moravian Records Among the Cherokees, which if you don't have that, I recommend you get a copy. And some of their church members had immigrated in early 1838, excuse me. And the Moravians arrived in late October of 1838 and give several accounts of the land before the majority of the Cherokees had arrived. These descriptions have recently been translated from the archaic German script in which they were written. Their first night in the nation was spent at Widow Weber's plantation at present Stillwell. They then came to Park Hill and stayed with Elias Boudinot, who had been one of their pupils in the East. And a side note, the Moravians sent a map back to Salem as identified in a letter the 14th of April, 1841. It's a letter from Miles Vogler of Beatty's Prairie to Reverend Theodore Schultz of Salem. It says, Brother Herman, that's Herman Ruda, and myself have drawn a very imperfect sketch of the country, the object of which is merely to show you how our people are situated and in what direction Spring Creek is from this place. You will find it enclosed in this sheet and will regard it only tolerable correct as respects the situation of our scattered church members. And this is likely the very earliest map of the Cherokee Nation West. And I'll be using excerpts of it in a couple of places in the presentation. But they actually do a very good job of this. And Jeff, we're going to have to figure out how to include this in the next volume. It's either a fold out or insert at the back, because it's an extremely important addition to our Cherokee history. Okay. Their journal entry, well, I will note this, of course, was made a couple of years later. So there are things that are on here that was not here in 1838 and 39 that my presentation's covering, but nevertheless, it still has a lot of the information. Okay, 30th of October, 1838, we drove with Elias Boudinot to Young Wolf's, who lives 5 miles from Park Hill. So you can see, here's Park Hill, and here's Young Wolf's, but the dot there is actually Young Wolf's home, and here's the stream town branch in Tahlequah, and Young Wolf gave the land from his improvements for the city of Tahlequah, and he supposedly lived on the bluff overlooking Tahlequah, pretty much where Melissa's and Joseph's house is now in Tahlequah. So this is the town branch, and then there's Young Wolf, and this is the Illinois River here. All of this isn't exactly the scale, but it's still a very good map overall. So the way led us through a large prairie in which we saw many gopher hills of particularly large size. Of course, we don't have these prairie dogs in eastern Oklahoma anymore, although they are in western Oklahoma. The gophers are animals the size of a rat, gray in color with a hairy tail. They burrow through the earth by means of their front feet, in which they have exceptional strength like moles. They carry this earth in a pouch of skin, which they have under their throats, and pile it together in mounds until they form a substantial hill in which they have their homes. These animals are very destructive to crops in fields and gardens, and they live mostly on the prairies. The land in the prairies is excellent, rich black earth on which nothing but grass, flowers, strawberries, and the like grows. In the spring, they're supposed to provide a gorgeous sight. Strawberries are there in such abundance that whole expanses are to be seen covered with them as with a red cloth. While we don't have the huge amount of wild strawberries that they had then, we do grow lots of strawberries, and Stillwell, of course, is known as the strawberry capital of the world and has the strawberry festival each year. But on the Gopher Hills, where the earth is soft and loose, the largest and best tasting ones are said to grow. When they are brought into cultivation, these prairies bear outstanding Welsh corn at 60 to 80 bushels an acre. Such prairies are frequently 12 to 20 miles long and 5 to 6 miles wide, and on the hills which bound them, fairly hard wood grows, which is serviceable for building and burning. Also found there now and then are good springs of fresh water. And Brother Young Wolf, at whose home we arrived after a drive of 2 hours, we were received with much joy and giving hospitality. He treated us to very pretty and delicious honey, which is to be found in plenty in the woodlands here in the land. He himself, however, had taken up beekeeping, much as Curtis Rohr does, because he's also a beekeeper. Said after we had eaten at noon, by the way, Reverend Youngwolf's wife was Hildebrand. Her father had come, who was a white lady, and her father had come to the Cherokee Nation around 1800 to build mills for the Cherokees. And he had 5 children at the time, that I believe all married Cherokees. And one of them, Peter Hildebrand, was a detachment leader during the removal process. So after we had eaten at noon, he drove with us into the region about 8 miles from his house, where our brothers and sisters have been living for the time being, which is on 14 Mile Creek. Because here's Young Wolf, which is near downtown Tahlequah now, and 14 Mile Creek, which is out near Halbert. Because 14 Mile Creek runs into the Grand River, which is here right at Halbert. Said in the past week, however, since they had gotten sick from fever there, they have moved to another region 14 miles from there on the Barren Fork of the Illinois. So they moved from there over to this area along Barren Fork Creek. This is Barren Fork Creek, and then there's the Illinois. Another reason they did not want to settle here was that it had been so hard for them to haul their provisions, which for now they have to buy so far from the settlement. And this way is closer to Arkansas, where they could buy more of their goods. They also didn't like the nearness of the prairies where their cattle wandered so far afield. Several of the cattle and horses were torn apart by the wolves, which are there in large packs. There were also outbreaks of smallpox in the region, which the Indians are so afraid of, and which have taken away whole nations of them. So 31st of October, Brother Ruda rode with Elias Boudinot to Park Hill to dispatch a letter to Salem to our dear correspondent, Brother Schultz. Brother Vogler visited Brother Austin Copeland, who lives 3 miles from here. He had built a new house and mill for himself on the Prairie, and is also working in his profession as a blacksmith. Brother Schmidt, in the meantime, had a conversation with his old friend Young Wolf, who showed him around on his Sizeville farm, which has excellent land. This year, in spite of the dry weather, he got an abundance of Welsh corn. From 1 bushel and 1 peck of wheat which he planted, he harvested 52 bushels. But also, he had lost several pigs to the wolves. There are 3 kinds of wolves here. The common wolf, which are also prevalent in Georgia and Tennessee. Then there are the small kind, which are known under the name prairie wolves, which would be the coyotes. And the third kind are the buffalo wolves, which can tear apart anything they get hold of: oxen, horses, even men if they meet them alone and without weapons in the bush or prairies. And now these are only live north of the United States and Canada. They once ranged as far south as Texas. 5th of November, after a heartfelt departure from our young wolf and his family, who had shown us such friendship, and may the Lord grant them a reward for this, we traveled to the Barren Forks of the Illinois, some 13 miles from here, which is this area, where our brothers and sisters have settled and formed a settlement scattered over 8 to 10 miles. The brethren Boaz and Israel rode to meet us and accompanied us to the houses of our brothers and sisters. We arrived around midday. We went to Brother Nicholas Ignatius' tent where our brothers and sisters had gathered. We had an extensive discussion with them in regard to their settling on the 14-mile creek and the reasons for their departure from there. Then was discussed our new settlement here in the Forks. And following the conversation with our brothers and sisters, we went this evening from there with Brother Richard Daniel Sanders to his tent, some 3 miles from there, where we found his family, who were sitting in front of the tent around a fire in the bush. We were received by them with much joy. And you notice they talk about the tents. Well, the tents were also issued to the Cherokees in the camps during that summer. And so they had to, and lived in the tents whenever they came west on the removal. 21st of November, we began our journey to Honey Creek on the north end of the Cherokee Territory, which here's Park Hill, and up here is Honey Creek, where it borders the land of the Senecas, which is farther up here. We went there to visit our 2 Cherokee sisters, Susanna Ridge, here's Mrs. Ridge's home on the north side of Honey Creek, and Susanna Fields and others of our acquaintances, and here's the Fields' home is on the south side of Honey Creek. This is all just west of Southwest City, Misouri, which is right about there. So we traveled along the various arms of the Illinois River through thick forest land, and then again through prairies, of which the largest is known under the name of Beatty's Prairie, and that's this area, and in which the parched grass is strikingly in full flames, so that only the road which leads through this was open. It was a horribly beautiful and magnificent sight. Although the weather was very frigid, we were not too cold, since the fire and smoke warmed us a little. On this journey, we saw some wolves and deer who grazed the prairie in herds of 10 or so. We also saw whole flocks of Welsh hens. In the flock, we saw 30 of them. We found the land everywhere of the first quality. There are only a few settlements we met with on the whole 70 miles of the road from Park Hill. Here and there are a few where the Cherokee immigrants who moved here in the spring have settled. We saw them very busily building houses and clearing land. These regions a short time ago were the halting place of the Osage, who on the whole have moved out of the area. Nevertheless, from time to time, one sees some who moved into the land around here. There are also some villages of the Delaware Indians who hunt all over the Cherokee land and are on a friendly footing with them. 30th of November. The Cherokees here are in civilized parts, and just as much as those in the east, have nice farms, well-built houses, and raise beef, cattle, horses, and pigs in quantity. Stan Wade and his father, Brother Christian David, have harvested so much corn this year that in addition to what they need for their own use, they still could sell 1,000 and some bushels at $1.50 a bushel. Only a small portion of the inhabitants here busy themselves with hunting, which here and there is still very good. Deer, bears, Welsh hens, the prairie hens or wild chickens, which are about as large as small barrels, are often brought down. However, the real hunting preserve of the Indians is 100 miles from here. It extends to the Rocky Mountains and is a region of several hundred miles consisting mostly of prairies in which one sees wild animals grazing, and especially the buffaloes, and there are hundreds and thousands in a single herd. The climate here is similar to that in Georgia and Tennessee, only that the winters here are uncommonly stronger. In the months of July and August, fever is generally prevalent in these parts, and on the whole, it is not as healthy here as it is east of the Mississippi. In the forts here, one encounters a great diversity of trees, among which several are unusual thickness and height, walnuts and oaks of various sorts, hickory, maple, poplars, or tulip trees, locust, water beeches, and many other types of wood. Chestnuts are not to be found here. And that by not having chestnut trees here in the West, the Cherokees lost one of their large food supplies because they relied heavily on chestnuts when we lived in the East. One finds some pines and cedars only in the mountains, and they are rare on the whole. And in the margins, and up the cane or reeds, which are an excellent fodder for the animals, grow especially in the low places near the rivers. Here in our region, they're rather plentiful. In the woods and prairies, there are snakes of various sorts, among which the diamond rattlesnake is said to be the most poisonous. There are also many poisonous spiders, tarantulas, scorpions, and millipedes, which live mostly in the rocks in the mountains and old wood and fallen down buildings. The Indians know various and very effective medicines against the bite of these poisonous animals. In the prairies, there are said to be countless swarms of flies, and in the summer, they're indescribable annoyance for horses and for people too. 10th of January, and this is 1839. And by this time, the Moravians had purchased an improvement on the Barren Fork of the Illinois River, just west of the present Proctor community, which is right here, which is listed as Egypt here. And here's Tyner, so this is Tyner Creek along here. So right here at the mouth of Tyner's Creek is the community of Proctor. And there, the mission that they established was, if you're familiar with the road at Camp Egan, the Methodist Church camp, it's directly across Barren Fork Creek, just east of Camp Egan. But Brother Vogler went on business at the smithy 8 miles from here. In several areas here in the land, bituminous coal is found, and iron and copper ore as well. Limestone is also in abundance. The road from Washington County, Arkansas, and then in the margin note to Fort Gibson, goes right by our house. So the lighter one is the road, which you see crosses back and forth across Barren Fork numerous times. And it goes on to Fort Gibson, through Park Hill to Fort Gibson. Since therefore every day travelers and freight wagons pass by here. Since the road is bad in places, and in many places is very mountainous, it is not unusual to see wagons pulled by 6 yoke of oxen. These animals are preferred here to horses for all work, especially for breaking up the grasslands on the prairies, which can often require 2 yoke of oxen to 1 plow. But once this is done and the ground has been cultivated for a year, the earth becomes as soft as ash heap. The Cherokees have some very productive salt works here, and there will be a sizable business carried on with this article in the neighboring states. The salt here is strong and comes in granules, but it's not as white as our usual kitchen salt. It's said to be especially good for curing meat. Sunday, the 3rd of February. Every kind of food is very expensive here and is not to be gotten for money. Therefore, many Indians must make do with nuts. There are many walnuts, hickory nuts, and hazelnuts. From the hickory nuts, the Indians make a milk or oil which they prepare their wheat. So that's our kanachi that they're talking about. Pecans, and since pecan or pecan nuts also grow here, which are known by the name Illinois nuts. And they are very tasty. Curtis also, along with beekeeping, grows pecans. We tap some sugar maple trees, which are nearby. Since at present, sugar is scarce here, nearly impossible to get. Now we have very few sugar maples in the area and none in the wild as far as I know now. Since we also do not have any milk at present, so we brewed our coffee with maple sugar syrup, which makes it taste pretty good. Here in our area, these trees are seldom met with, but they're plentiful in other areas of Arkansas. And this entire country is referred to as Arkansas country. And in several regions, much sugar will be cooked from them this month. 6th of March. The flight of wild pigeons lasted several hours this morning. There were many thousands of them and then still more thousands. And unfortunately, they became extinct by the 1890s because they were so plentiful that people would go out and kill them to eat. But they were wiped out later. Sunday, 24th of March. In the last week, the last detachment of Cherokees have finally arrived, so that now the immigration which began on the 1st of September of last year has now reached its end. And the 15 or 16,000 Indians are now in their new homeland here in the West. And then written in the margin, the entire Cherokee Nation, including those who were already living here in the West, now amounts to 23,000 souls. He writes, may God grant that they may possess this land a right long time, and that they may become a prosperous and happy people here, that many of those may be blessed not only temporally, but also eternally. So the 1st of April, and you notice that Mrs. Weber's plantation at Stillwell, which is where Moravians first came to. And then here is the area, Sequoyah, then the Park Hill area. And here. And Olson Cemetery, which is actually is a little bit more west of there, but that's near where Mrs. Ridge's home was. April 1st, during this past winter, our Indians were busy getting land ready to sow with Welsh corn, and it's getting time for planting now. Not too much can be done with cultivating the corn this year, however, since they're still busy with building their houses and other work, and most of them are still getting sick with fever from time to time. So the people began to rebuild their houses and farms. So the two governments also worked to build the government into one. On April 23rd, 1839, Chief John Ross wrote to the three chiefs of the old settlers, John Brown, John Rogers, and John Looney. Ross suggested that a joint council be held to discuss what kind of government structure was needed to reunite the Cherokee people. He wrote, we are all of the household of the Cherokee family and of one blood. Therefore, together, they should take measures for cementing our reunion as a nation by establishing the basis of a government. The old settler chiefs agreed to meet on June 3rd, 1839. Over 6,000 Cherokees assembled at the Takatoka campground, 4 miles northeast of Tahlequah, which is not far from where David Hampton lives, just east of there. John Brown, principal chief of the Old Settlers, addressed the gathering. We joyfully welcome you to our country. The whole land is before you. You may freely go wherever you choose and select any places for settlement you may please. You're eligible to any of the offices. Next July will be an election for members of both houses of our legislature. At those elections, you will be voters. Meanwhile, it's expected that you will be subject to our government and laws. And for the immigrant Cherokees, this was very problematic. Brown spoke of the area as our country, which implied that the new immigrants were being admitted as a privilege and not as a right. More disturbing was the implication that the new arrivals had no government of their own and would submit to the government of the old settlers. And this was in direct opposition to the resolution passed in the East on August 1st, 1838. It also meant that the majority of the Cherokees would be governed by the minority. On June 10th, John Ross explained to John Brown and other leaders of the old settlers that they could not accept their terms. Brown responded that for all matters growing out of removal, the immigrant Cherokees would be allowed their own chiefs and committee and council, with the name being the Eastern Cherokee Nation. Brown proposed that there be two governments in the same territory. On June 20th, the Council of Takatoka was declared by the old settler chiefs to be over without there being a resolution to the problem of the two governments. Before everyone left, however, two Cherokees whose fame and popularity transcended party lines, Sequoyah and Jess Bushyhead, called upon the people to meet again on July 1st to reunite the Cherokee Nation. And Sequoyah was an old settler, whereas Jess Bushyhead was an immigrant Cherokee who had also led one of the detachments. On June 22nd, principal leaders of the Treaty Party, Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and nephew Elias Boudinot, were all executed for their role in signing the 1835 treaty. And despite this, the council called for by Bushyhead and Sequoyah convened at Illinois Campground, which was a couple of miles north of Park Hill. Only about 2,000 Cherokees attended, with probably less than 150 of them being old settlers. The only old settler chief to attend was John Looney. An act of union was approved and signed on July 12th by the immigrant Cherokees, but the old Cherokees had not yet agreed to it. The Moravians gave the following accounts in their journey. Sunday, 28th of July, 1839. Brother Bushyhead called on us on his way home from the council. The hope for a brotherly agreement among the various parties in the nation seems to be better now. However, everything is still very uncertain. And for our part, we can only watch in stillness and patience and diligently beg the Lord for help for this poor, disowned, and disinherited people. 19th of August. In the evening, Brother Butler and Brother George Hicks came up to visit us. From the latter, it's Brother Hicks, we received the news that the long-awaited unification of the parties in the nation is about to be realized. And this picture of George Hicks comes from the Moravian archives in Bethlehem. There was also one of Israel who was mentioned earlier, but I forgot to go back and include it. And George Hicks also was one of the detachment leaders. And while he was on the road in Illinois, he sent a fantastic letter back to the Moravians describing the condition of the Cherokees on the road there. And so that should be included in this next volume. But the old settlers agreed to the Act of Union and signed it on August 23rd, 1839. And part of the Act of Union States. Whereas our fathers have existed as a separate and distinct nation in the possession and exercise of the essential and appropriate attributes of sovereignty from a period extending into antiquity beyond the records and memory of man. And whereas these attributes, with the rights and franchises which they involve, remain still in full force and virtue, as do also the national and social relations of the Cherokee people to each other and to the body politic, excepting in those particulars which have grown out of the provisions of the treaties of 1817 and 1819 between the United States and the Cherokee Nation, under which a portion of our people removed to this country and became a separate community. But the force of the circumstances having recently compelled the body of the Eastern Cherokees to remove to this country, thus bringing together again the two branches of the ancient Cherokee family, it has become essential to the general welfare that a union should be formed and a system of government matured, adapted to their present condition, and providing equally for the protection of each individual and the enjoyment of all his rights. Therefore, we, the people composing of the Eastern and Western Cherokee Nations and National Convention assemble, by virtue of our original and unalienable rights, do hereby solemnly and mutually agree to form ourselves into one body politic under the style and title of the Cherokee Nation. So this act of union paved the way for a constitutional convention and the adoption of a new constitution on September 6, 1839. And this, by the way, is when we celebrate our Cherokee National Holiday, we're celebrating the September 6, 1839 Constitution, which we do each year during Labor Day weekend. But in talking about this, the Moravian missionary Miles Vogler gave the following account in a letter to Reverend Schultz in Salem, dated October 8, 1839, the Cherokee Mission. Dear brother, I'm very glad to inform you at this time that a kind of union has taken place between the old settlers and immigrants. I was at council on the fourth ultimate, at which time the new Constitution was laid before the convention by Mr. Ross. This convention consisted of 50 persons. 25 were old settlers. Now, this is an interesting detail that we did not know, and had Miles Vogler not recorded, we wouldn't have, that our constitutional convention for the 1839 Constitution was made up of 25 old settlers and 25 of the recently immigrated and treaty party Cherokees. So it's interesting that there were that many of the old settlers that were included in writing the Constitution. Okay, it goes on to say, after the convention read the Constitution and made some necessary amendments, it was presented to the people, with whose approbation it met and consequently was adopted. After this, the people elected their offices. John Ross, of course, was appointed principal chief. Joseph Vance, second principal chief. This is not the one not the one who formerly lived near Spring Place. But he actually, this Joseph Van was an old settler and would have been the great uncle of Will Rogers. Major Lowry, Richard Taylor, and George Hicks refused to hold any offices. The members of the council and the committee are mostly all strangers to me, and I suppose we to them. Mr. Ross's council will adjourn this week after a long and tedious session. Mr. Brown is trying to hold a council which is to commence this week. I do not know who will attend it, as the majority of old settlers have united themselves with Mr. Ross. Perhaps some of the treaty party will join Brown, but if they do, it will amount to little. Jack Bell and Stan Wadey are going to Washington as the delegates of the treaty party. Signed, M. Vogler. Thus, our new Constitution was implemented and remained in place until 1975, when a new Constitution was passed by the people. Our nation was on its way to being rebuilt, and the blessing asked for by the Moravian missionary in April of 1839 has come to pass. May God grant that they may possess this land a right long time, that they may become a prosperous and happy people here. Thank you. Okay. Well, as you can see, the Moravian records add a great deal to our knowledge of our Cherokee history, especially, well, during the entire time frame that they're with us. So, okay. Any questions, discussion? And Peggy, we certainly appreciate the Moravian Archives and Jeff for these volumes and maintaining these records of our history.
It's our history as well, Jack, and we are as proud of it as you are. Thank you.
Truly.
Jack, thank you. This was so moving and powerful, and it just makes it more important to love each other and keep our Cherokee Nation strong. It's beautiful.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Agree.
Jack, is
Yeah.
there a reason why the Moravians called their mission Egypt?
Oh, yes. They were not happy with that mission site there, and there was a lot of death. It was said there were ponds of standing water and so forth along the creek there, so that I think there was a lot of malaria and a lot of people died. And so the majority of their church members then moved north to Beatty's Prairie. And so they moved, and they could never decide on a name for that mission site there on the Barren Fork that they weren't happy with anyway. So then when they moved to Beatty's Prairie and established the mission there, they named that one Canaan. And so they named the old one Egypt. That was after they had moved. So it was out of Egypt into Canaan.
Thank you.
Which I thought was well, rather it was appropriate for them, but that is an interesting story. I'm glad you asked that.
Jack, where's the, is it in the letters that are in these books that have recently published that tell that stories? Is that where you pull that together, I suppose?
All of this will be out of information from the next volume that Jeff is working on now. Richard and Daniel sent this to me. I first gave this, or at least a modified portion of this, in 2014, and I can't remember whom I gave it. So, but it was, I think, without a PowerPoint at the time. But they sent it to me, and I used that sometime in 2014. So, but I thought it would be appropriate since the new book will be out later this year. Right, Jeff? And he's nodding his agreement. So
That is correct.
good. And we appreciate your work on it. You're taking over for what Richard had done.
Oh, it's an honor and a pleasure. I actually knew Richard, and Daniel was my pastor when I was a teenager, so there's a special connection there already.
Good. So,
Jack, that was wonderful. And I think one of the things that it shows is, I think the general public think the Cherokee were so decimated by the time they got to the West, which of course they were, but it shows how hard they worked and what they did to put their communities and their government back together. And I think that's one of the big things that this volume is going to I think that's what scholars will glean from it. Thank you for that presentation.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. I said, I think those little notes, like the 25 old settlers were part of the Constitutional Convention and 25 of the other Cherokees, are significant details.
Mhm.
Just like there's a detail with the 1817 or 1819 treaty that's in the Moravian records that Charles Hicks had told the Moravians that he recorded it, but it evidently wasn't recorded anywhere else, is that when they were negotiating the 1819 treaty, they had allowed some of the younger people to work on the negotiations, but about 3/4 of them spoke English. But the other quarter of the people working on it did not speak English at all, but all of them spoke and understood Cherokee. So it said that the group speaking English would lapse into English, and so the ones that only spoke Cherokee would have to object and ask them to speak in Cherokee, so that they actually provided that if you started speaking English, you had to pay a fine. So that was, I think, an interesting detail of that treaty analysis. And also the problem with our language that early, 1819, that 3/4 of them were negotiating in English, and as opposed to the ones that could not understand it. So there are little details like that that we don't get from anywhere else. So once again, we thank the Moravians for saving these records for us.
I think also to note that Miles Vogler was very, very young when he's writing this. Smith is very, very old. But Miles Vogler, I don't even know his age. We could figure that out. But he was really young.
Yeah, he wasn't married yet.
Right. This is before he married Sophia Vogler. Yeah. Sophia Ruda.
And he does die at the mission, I think at the Canaan mission, but he's buried at the Oaks mission.
He and Sophia Vogler are there at the mission. And not only does Miles Vogler die, but a child that they had just had dies as well. Yes. So she is just decimated. And that's when she comes back east.
But Miles and their child are both at the Oaks.
That's where they're buried.
Okay.